Athena hides Odysseus in a mist and leads him in the guise of a child toward the palace. She reiterates the advice of Nausicaa by telling Odysseus to go to Queen Arete. Odysseus enters the magnificent palace and throws his arms around the queen's knees as Athena withdraws her mist. Odysseus pleads for mercy and then falls into the ashes underneath the hearth. All are silent until the oldest lord cries out for his king to welcome the stranger. King Alcinous, spurred by his subject, welcomes Odysseus with food and drink. Without asking Odysseus' name or where he's from, the king convenes the evening and calls for an assembly in the morning to help the stranger return home. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. We are working through our year of Homer, and so we are on book 7 in the Odyssey. And so again, we're very happy to have and welcome Mr. Eli Stone, who serves as an administrative assistant to the president of the University of Tulsa's Honors College, which is a great books-based program, something we're very excited about in our local community here in Eastern Oklahoma. Eli, welcome.
Hey, great to be here. Again, week 2, right?
Again, yes, it is again. Let's just talk about like where we are in this read. Like I said, I'm trying to have more of an appreciation for Telemachus's coming of age arc. That's something I very intentionally wanted to come into. I'm very much also trying to find out the positive side of Odysseus, if that makes sense. The first time I read it, everyone was just like, Odysseus is this amazing character. And which we haven't really been exposed to yet, but I was very negative on him. And so that's mainly how I focused throughout the most of the text, was finding reasons that he's not a good leader. And so this time I'm trying to pull out, I think, a lot of these positive themes of coming home, the endurance, the thumos, to actually like endure, right? To be hated by the gods, to suffer, and to actually make it home to your wife and family. So for me, I think this is my third read through, and I'm enjoying it. I'm finding a lot more here than I think I did the last 2 times.
Yeah, I certainly have come to appreciate this book a lot more on my second read through myself. As I mentioned last time, that this is my second reading of this book, and I've got a lot more tools at my disposal to help me dig through it. But yeah, I really enjoy the Odyssey a lot more than the Iliad, and I think there's a reason why so many people, even as recent as you have these generals in the Civil War that are reading the Odyssey that are like, this is the book, right? And there's just something enduring about it. There's something timeless. There's a lot to glean from Odysseus and his travels, and a lot of the people that he meets along the way. So yeah, I'm right there with you.
I don't know. That would be a bold statement for me to say I like the Odyssey more than the Iliad. Really, my read of the Iliad this time was so enjoyable. Reading it with our Sunday Great Books, our little small group that we have, and I think, iron sharpens iron, and seeing everyone's comments, I think was very helpful to me. I really love the contrast of Achilles and Hector. I love the question of what is a good man. Homer bringing forth this kind of nascent understanding of virtue, of what does it mean to be a good man, of this arete, this excellence. I really enjoy that, and I really enjoy the narrative, because I think it's very thick with Homer the teacher, right? Because he's kind of being there's an undercurrent that kind of erodes what we believe his current audience's understanding of virtue to be, right? It's an aristocratic Greek audience. They're cheering for Achilles. The young men want to be like Achilles. We even see that Socrates is raging against that. Even a couple hundred years later, they're all still liking Achilles. And I just think that there's this wonderful wit to Homer taking like the lead Trojan, Hector, and making him this example and this foil against Achilles. I just love it. I love the entire narrative, and it's something I really enjoy reading with people. The Odyssey, it just has so many layers for me. Like I enjoy the journey home. I enjoy the I need to be on my soil. I need to be back with my home, my wife, my child, etc. Even when I'm offered immortality, even when I'm offered maybe even marriage to a princess, right? Just as an example. Um, but I struggle because he is such a complex character. We're not quite there yet in the tale, but we just once he starts retelling what has happened to him, because we're in media res. We picked up with him on Calypso's Island. We're already what, like 8 years deep, and so we're like, what has been going on with him? We don't know these narratives, and I think when his narrative starts to really expand, his character becomes incredibly conflicted for me.
I agree, and I think Homer has an expert weaving, I guess you could say, of narrative, like the narrator's voice, Homer's voice versus Zeus's voice versus Odysseus's versus everything else, right? So there's and it happens in as Odysseus is telling his story, is he will say, this is what happened, or this is what someone else said, and Homer never loses track of who is speaking when and in what circumstances is this story being told right now. And so I think it does lend itself to a lot of complexity. And Odysseus's character, that's how we're very introduced to him at the very beginning, right? The polytropos man, the man of many sides, the man of many faces, the man of many twists and turns, right? There's lots of different potential translations of this, but I think that's what I kind of like about it, is that there is a complexity to Odysseus, but there's a complexity to all of us, and there's a complexity to living in a society, in a polis, because there are many different people, and there are many different ways you have to interact with these people, and the art of rhetoric, the art of navigating and you could say expressing yourself to various different types of people in such a way that you can do what it is you need to do as a leader. You can do what it is you need to do as a vagabond and a wanderer or a stranger in a land. There's a lot of complexity, but that goes into all of those decisions. And I think that this book really highlights that complexity, and I think that's why I really like it. But to your earlier point, right, there is something charming about the Iliad. It's very stark in its contrasts. It's very dramatic in its theme. It is war, right? So there's consequences and serious consequences for misstepping. So they're just very different books, and so I think it's perfectly reasonable for someone to say, well, I like this one versus this one, and it's not that I don't like that one, or it's I just can't choose between them because they're just so different. So yeah, many different reactions to these texts.
I think you're right. The complexity of the human condition is that aspect is one of the reasons that the Odyssey is a great text. We see that there's this man of twists and turns. It's not just his journey of twists and turns, but he is the man of twists and turns, and that complexity and how you read him. Yeah, sure. I think that plays into it very deeply. I think, and I'm just kind of going off the fly here, kind of just introspection of why is it that I tend to gravitate back towards the Iliad? Because right now I'm actually reading, so I also teach the great books for our diaconate program. And our diaconate program just started, our new class. So I am now also reading the Iliad again already with them. They're reading 4 books a month. They're on a very similar pace than we are. I have not told them about our guide because I don't want to give them all the answers. So I have not told them about the guide.
There's not a podcast. Don't.
Yeah, there's not a podcast. I know nothing. We're just going to sit in this room and talk about it. But they're a great group. There's 19 of them right now, and we're working through it. I think we have very lively conversations, and I think one thing is like I very much treat Hector as a hero in my imagination. I like cheering for him. I think he's that tragic hero. He's a suffering hero, and I really like him. Yes, he makes some mistakes, but because of the fatalism of the Iliad, I'm not entirely sure how culpable he is. I like him. I like him a lot, and so did our medieval, ancestors. He's the first of the 9 worthies. I think we've talked about this devotion on the podcast before. That devotion might be a strong word, right? This kind of chivalry. Meditation on the 9 worthies, the 3 Jews, the 3 pagans, and the 3 Christians. And so Hector is the first, because the pagans actually come first in that array. And so Hector is that one. He's the one that kicks off this life of virtue. What does it actually mean to be an excellent man? You know who is not one of the nine worthies? Odysseus. He is not one of the nine worthies. I am very medieval in my approach to Odysseus. Insofar as, I know we're not supposed to skip ahead, but if we just jump another 2,000 years, Dante places Odysseus in hell.
And not at the top of hell either. It's like he's pretty deep in there, right?
He's pretty deep. And you know what? I'm very much on Team Dante, I think. And, for a lot of people who are first time readers, they're like, what are you talking about? Look at this man. He's suffered. He said no to Calypso's immortality. Like, we're on book 7. Like, it seems like he's going to say no to the marriage proposal of Nausicaa. Like, what has he done? Well, we'll find out. But I still, even on my second read, I'm not overly sympathetic to him. And I think because I'm robbed of a character that I can clearly cheer for, like I have in the Iliad with Hector, I think that might be one reason I gravitate more towards it.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly fair. I mean, yeah, Odysseus is a complex character, and maybe there's something to be said too. Like in the Iliad, in the Iliad, Homer has to truncate his characters a little bit. You don't get an entire epic dedicated to Hector or to Achilles. These characters are a little bit superficial compared to the treatment that we have of Odysseus here. And so I think that, at least on a surface level, you're going to have to have a very comparatively shallow character, I guess you could say. Then like you won't get an exhaustive treatment on all of Hector's virtues and all of his vices and everything like you would here in the Odyssey, precisely because this whole book is dedicated to Odysseus and his journey home. So I think there's an element of that as well that goes into it. But also there's so much contextual knowledge that is kind of required, I think, to appreciate the Odyssey in a way that people stabbing each other at Troy doesn't necessarily require as much background knowledge to get
there's a lot
sort of
less
message
people,
across.
Yeah, there's a lot less people getting stabbed in the face in the Odyssey. Okay, very good. Oh, very good. All right, let's get into book 7. So what do we see in book 7? So let's just kind of skim this narrative. So we have that Nausicaa makes it back home to the palace. We see Odysseus is following the orders of Nausicaa, and so we get Athena. We kind of talked about this last week of Athena's been helping him a lot, but does he actually know it's her? Should he know it's her, given the relationship that he had with her in the Iliad? You pointed out last week that yes, but think of the however many years he's been suffering. It's natural to ask where is she? Has she been helping me? But here she is again, and so she comes under the guise of a child to lead him into the palace. There's a few things here that I think are interesting because she is going to basically reiterate the advice of Nausicaa of going to the queen. There's a few things here that I think are noteworthy. The first thing I would point out is, I don't know, line 35 or so. Notice that part of this covering him in a mist. So not only is he not going to walk in with Nausicaa, right? But also he is going to walk into a mist so the strangers can't see him at all. Right? We've kind of doubled down on this. So first it was don't walk with Nausicaa. Now it's they're not going to be able to see you at all because you're in this mist. And around 35 or so, she actually mentions this explicitly. The men here never suffer strangers gladly and have no love for hosting a man from foreign lands. Now, on a certain level, that makes sense to us. This is an island. It's an island community. They are not used to strangers. We find out they're kind of at the edge of the world. Really, they're only used to the gods visiting them. On the other hand, this runs quite contrary and kind of grates against the concept of guest friendship, which I think is a huge theme here, because then if you jump over to 60, she has a wonderful line at 59 where she says, "In every venture, the bold man comes off best. Even the wanderer bound from distant shores." And so she basically tells him, listen, you need to go to the Queen Arete. She is called, and she earns the name. She answers all our prayers. And so she serves this intercessor role that he needs to go throw himself at the queen, and she'll serve as the intercessor to maybe what we might find as a people group that's not entirely open to strangers, or maybe not even accustomed to welcoming them, even if they do know about guest friendship.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting theme that you're picking up on here. So as I kind of mentioned, or we were talking about just very briefly, kind of in the introduction here, like Odysseus has to navigate a people that he like and navigate a civilization with very unique politics, and he's a complete stranger there. And so it's very providential, or, it's all orchestrated by Athena, that he meets Nausicaa to tell him exactly who to go speak to. And that's reaffirmed kind of by Athena herself in this guise of being a young girl. But what we see about these Phaeacians, is that, as you mentioned, they're distrustful of strangers. And I think part of this is because they are so remote from other countries. So think about it in this way. If you are on a landmass and you have a lot of neighbor civilizations, you can band together, and if there is something that happens, say like someone comes and steals your wife and takes her to the other side of the world, you can all band together and go fight a 10-year war and go sack that city, raze it to the ground, and take your wife back. As we've just seen happen in the Iliad. Or we don't quite see it all happen in the Iliad, but that's what happens at Troy. Here, though, they're isolated from pretty much the rest of the world. And so I think on a very natural level, there would probably be some suspicion of it. Being in the middle of the ocean and being a seafaring people, they're probably well experienced with piracy and these other kind of roving bands of other mercenary groups that would come onto the ocean to just take what they could and leave. But the other interesting thing about this civilization, which we'll see a glimpse of in this book, and we'll see something else about it in the next, is that this is a very advanced civilization, technically speaking. So the Phaeacians, or the Phaeacians, have, as you mentioned, a very close relationship with the gods. They have things that can serve them just by being asked to. And I think there's an interesting relationship to maybe be explored there, because I think in our civilization, we would say we don't have a very strong culture of guest friendship. But we also live in a culture that's very comfortable, and there are a lot of luxuries very easily available. In a culture where there are no luxuries available, you have to walk from one city to the next, and it takes you a whole day to get a third of the way to where you need to go. You're going to be relying on strangers and their hospitality, as you meet these villages, and you ask to stay with someone for the night as you're passing through their town. And in this kind of society where they're very insular, they're not a war-going country, they're a very peaceful country, they have a lot of technology at their disposal, and they have a close relationship with the gods. In some ways, it becomes not as necessary to have a strong culture of guest friendship, because you don't rely on hospitality for anything. Everyone has what they need. And I think that's a very interesting element of this, and maybe an explanation for why there's some suspicion of foreigners, but also just not a culture of guest friendship.
But do you find that though to be a negative? Like it's an excuse for them about why they wouldn't be like habituated to it. I don't think they have. It's not common for them. But do you still find it though to be a negative? Because like guest friendship is a good, correct? So like on a taking it as like a very negative statement, they have a certain decadence about them that then causes them to be insular, and that they don't welcome the guest the way that they should, because the guest friendship can't be reduced to a simple practical relationship, which it is in a lot of ways, right? You're traveling, you need to stay at someone's place, there's not a hotel, etc. But at the same time, there's also a spiritual concept to it, that the guest and the host are watched over by Zeus. And your guests also might even be gods, which is actually mentioned in the book later. So they have reasons that maybe this has eroded in their culture, but overall we would still take that as a negative, correct?
No, yeah, no, certainly. I don't think it reflects well on the Phaeacians that there's a bunch of salty sea dogs that don't trust strangers. Um, but it's kind of a reality to be addressed. Um, but I do think they still have it. Like there are still vestiges of it, right? Otherwise, Nausicaa wouldn't be able to counsel Odysseus and say, "Go and speak with my mother," because she will get you the hospitality that you seek. I do think it's interesting that it is the queen who offers the hospitality and not the king. And I don't know why this is, and I would have to think about it a lot more, I think. But it is, I would argue, a pretty stark departure from customs. We've seen elsewhere Nestor, the king, is the one who provides Telemachus. Before him, it's Menelaus who provides the hospitality. Menelaus and his wife, Helen, obviously, also, she helps provide that hospitality. But it's always initiated by the king, and here it's not.
What's interesting there is that obviously, like, I think any Catholic that's reading this and sees that it's the queen who's going to serve as the intercessor, right? Because you still read her as the intercessor to whom? The king. It's still ultimately the king that makes the decision, right? So kind of like your point, the normal touch point person to make the decision on guest friendship is the king. So here we have the woman, the queen, Queen Arete, playing that role and being even known for that role. So one, her name's Arete, which immediately we think of Arete as in like the excellence, the virtue. And then Fagles has a note on the etymology here that it's also a play off of the word to prayer, right? Which is actually then what Homer plays off explicitly. Arete, she is called and earns the name. She answers all our prayers, right? She is the intercessor for them. But she's an intercessor between the people and the king. And this obviously reflects another Bronze Age culture that we are very familiar with, which is the Hebrews, and particularly the relationship between Solomon and Bathsheba. Now, there, it's his mother, right? In the Hebrew culture, the mother was queen, not one of the wives. But Bathsheba plays this role, right? She's the intercessor of the people to King Solomon. She even has a throne to the right of his, and we believe this to be a foreshadowing, a type of Mary in the Old Testament. We see Mary play that role. Christ is king. Mary becomes queen, and she plays that intercessor role at the wedding of Cana, right? Do whatever he tells you. She plays that role for the people. So I just found it fascinating that here we have another Bronze Age culture, and the timing here is real close. Troy falls at what, 11 something or 1250, I think is when.
Yeah, in that neighborhood.
And the zenith of David's reign is like 1000 BC. So you tack on a few years for the end of his reign and with King Solomon and Bathsheba. I mean, you're really close. These narratives are only at max maybe 200 years apart from one another, and you're seeing two very distinct cultures, but two Bronze Age cultures having the queen as an intercessor. I mean, it's just something I think any Catholic that reads that it jumps off at the page. I don't think that's like a grand insight.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous insight as far as like these Bronze Age cultures growing, developing in very different parts of the world, but still having this kind of queen intercessory figure, a very motherly, queenly figure, right? But the other interesting thing that sticks out to me in Athena's description of this queen mother figure is her lineage. So this is where we get a glimpse into why the Phaeacians are so beloved by the gods. So we learn that the king, Alcinous, or Alcinous, I think, as you've mentioned before, or there's all of these Greek names, and no one knows how they're actually
Okay, we're
pronounced.
from
But
Oklahoma. When we play the Oklahoma card a lot, when we have to pronounce all the names.
oh yeah, I love it. But I mean, you get into the scholarly literature, and half of the debates are all about how to
Yeah,
pronounce
they don't
these
agree.
things.
I've
So
looked it up and they all disagree. They're like Nausicaa. I'm like, well, that's how Fagel says it. And I was like, no one says it like that. I'm like, okay, you know what? I quit. I'm Oklahoman. We're just going to say it however we please. So
yeah,
anyway, go ahead. Yeah, the lineage is interesting. So tell us about it.
so yeah, the king Alcinous is a descendant of Poseidon. Nausithous is his grandfather, and Nausithous is a son of Poseidon. And so kind of Poseidon's his great grandfather, if you will. And she also mentions, Athena, that is, mentions that Arete is cut from the same stock. So she is also descended from the gods. And so you have, they're clearly mortal, or they're presented as mortal in this text, but they do have divine lineage to them. And so I think this gives us some context for why they're so favored by the gods. The other interesting thing that is mentioned about Arete is that she settles disputes between men, that she goes out and serves a very public role in the society. Down here, just past line 80, or actually, let's start at line 80. Such is her pride of place and always will be so, dear to her loving children, to Alcinous himself, and to all our people. They gaze on her as a god, saluting her warmly on walks through town. She lacks nothing in good sense and judgment. She can dissolve quarrels even among men, whoever wins her sympathies. If only our queen will take you to heart, then there is hope that you will see your loved ones reach your high-roofed house, your native land, at last. And so she plays a very prominent role in the public life of this society, the Phaeacian society, that it would be very uncommon for a woman to play. But I think this ties into a theme that you touched on last time, which was that Nausicaa in particular, but I think Arete ties into this, or Arete ties into this, that Odysseus is being tempted to stay with this society, potentially being tempted to stay with Nausicaa, who is a Penelope figure. We learn that Nausicaa is a very witty, a very crafty, and a very politically cunning figure, very much like Odysseus himself, and very much from what we've heard of Odysseus, how he describes Penelope, and from what we've seen of Penelope in the first few books. But here, Arete is also kind of put in some of this language, and I think this is kind of like a reaffirmation, right? Like, Nausicaa's mother is very crafty and wise, just like Penelope, which reinforces that she herself got this from her mother, that she is a wonderful person, a wonderful candidate for a wife. And the other hint here is that Odysseus could also be grafted into this divine family, right? That he would be set up for life here on this island with these people, being married into Poseidon's lineage, which is also interesting because Poseidon is the one that Odysseus has had so much trouble with. And Poseidon is, of course, the one who has prevented Odysseus from getting home.
Yeah, that would be a good turn of phrase, turn in the book if Odysseus married into Poseidon's family, given the general narrative. One thing that occurred to me while you were talking is the relationship between the Phaeacians, this island, and the city of peace on Achilles' shield. Because the two things that you see, if we think about it all the way back to Achilles' shield, the city of peace and the city of war, the thing that characterizes the city at peace is two things. One is a marriage, which we're definitely seeing that theme with Nausicaa and Odysseus. The other one is the ability to resolve disputes. And I've always found that fascinating, that the city of peace is not the city without disputes. It's a city that has the capacity to have justice and to resolve these disputes. And as you think about, as you were mentioning, Queen Arete walking through the city, this island polis, and resolving quarrels and conflicts even amongst men, this really has a deep echo of that city of peace.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a tremendous insight. That's something I wouldn't have come up, and in fact, I hadn't made that connection before. So that is a very valuable connection, I think, though.
That shield just kind of lives rent free in my head for whatever reason. I just think because I think the first time you read the Iliad, people are getting speared in the face, you kind of see things are going on. But then when you run into the narrative of the shield, it is just like, it's the most philosophically thick thing that you have in Homer. And it's really where you see like, oh wait, Homer has a ton of depth, and I probably need to be taking this whole narrative a lot more seriously. Because the first time I read the Iliad, like I liked it, it was good, but I remember very clearly the shield narrative, and that really showing me that, like, you know what, I think there's a lot going on in it. The guy that writes this book, right, this one particular book or chapter on the shield, is not a guy who's writing a flat narrative for the rest of the time, or is just an echo of his culture. There's
No,
something
and
happening here.
yeah, you're correct. I mean, it should jump out at you because it is so different, right? Like there is something very different about this book compared to all of the other books in the Iliad.
Right.
And so he even kind of signals that for his readers themselves. Like, if it wasn't obvious that you need to be listening for this part, it's just going to be very different, right?
I agree. Let's look at earlier you mentioned that they have technology. Let's look at that. So we get this narrative. Odysseus is coming closer to the palace. Like 105 or so, it says, and dogs of gold and silver were stationed either side, forged by the god of fire with all his cunning craft, to keep watch on the generous King Alcinous, his palace, his immortal guard dogs, ageless all their days. So what was interesting is that when we read this and discussed this in our Sunday kind of great books thing, amongst beer and charcuterie boards and everything else, what we realized very quickly is that half our group just took these as statues. That this was just, they just took them and moved right over them. Most people, when we talked about, I think I might have brought it up as a joke, like the robot dogs, and everyone's like, "What are you talking about?" I think you used the word that's probably most apt, right? Because robot would be an anachronism, but these are automatons, right? These are machines that can move on themselves. They have autonomy, and these come from Hephaestus. And my understanding is that Hephaestus's workshop is full of these. I mean, they are these kind of this proto understanding of a robot. I don't like the word robot because it brings in like pistons and circuit boards and stuff like that wouldn't have been in the Greek imagination. But it is in the Greek imagination that the blacksmith god can make machines so skilled that they are somewhat alive. And his workshop has these little automaton helpers.
Yeah, what's interesting is when you look at this thing or theme or idea in Greek culture, and really even a little bit in Aristotle when he's talking about like what animates or what moves the automaton, he uses very similar language to human, right? Like he uses like this concept of an anima or a soul, like that there is something in this that is making it move. And so, yeah, I think it is wise to distance ourselves from the idea of circuitry because it's very mechanistic, like it's just a machine. For this culture, these are not just machines. They're machines, or they're vessels for something else. Like you could say that they're statues, but they're statues that have a soul in such a way that it enables them to move. And so it's very there's very little, right? There's very little that we have from Greek culture really kind of explaining in depth. These often appear in mythic kind of context. So you have the Talos, which guards an island, and it's like this colossal thing that just wades in the ocean, and any ship that comes by, it just smashes to pieces. You have Hephaestus's workshop, where he has his helpers, and he just says a word and they'll turn on and they'll do the thing that he told them to do. And then here we have these guard dogs, right? And so they're, I think if you just read the text on its surface, it's not clear that these are animated guard dogs. And that was actually my own interpretation. Like, as we were reading through this in the Sunday Great Books, I was just reading this text and I'm like, oh, these are just like, I didn't get at all that these are like automaton or robotic or whatever. They have any kind of life to them. But you read ahead to the next book and it's very clear that their ships have some kind of animating technology to them, or technology may not be the right word. But there is something in the ships that allows them to move without being piloted. And the king kind of explains this more in Book 8, which we'll see next time. But it is, so yes, it is fascinating, like to think that Odysseus, as he's marveling at the wealth of this society, he looks up at the palace and it's decked out with ivory and bronze and all of these precious metals and gems, and he has these incredible technologically advanced for his age automaton that serve to guard his palace. And I think this shows, as you mentioned, right, these are things that have to be crafted by the gods. I think the only exception is Daedalus. Daedalus, the master craftsman who makes Icarus's wings, for example. He's also able to create these sorts of things, but he's the only mortal that has ever attributed something like this. All of these are gifts from the gods, as it were. And that's just, it reinforces, I think, this idea that the Phaeacians are very prosperous as a country. They are favored by the gods. They have a great relationship with them. But this also, in some ways, kind of sets them apart and puts them a little bit aloof when it comes to other civilizations. Other mortal civilization to invite guests is, well, I don't want this riffraff on my island. Like, I've got all of my servants here, and these uncultured swine don't even have ships that can pilot themselves. So maybe there's some sort of elitist thread in this society. But at least as far as
very close to a utopia, right?
Yeah, it is, and I think
utopia.
But
and
that's
anything alien to a utopia is always going to be a threat, because if you have something that's perfect, you don't need to add anything to it, and something alien coming to it is always going to be an addition.
And I think that amplifies the temptation for Odysseus too, because he is going like. So think about this again, right? This temptation. Should Odysseus continue and go to see his homecoming, or should he stay and potentially marry Nausicaa and stay in the civilization? It's a very peaceful civilization. He'd be marrying into Poseidon's family. He'd be marrying another Penelope. There are a lot of elements, I think, here that are tempting Odysseus to potentially stay and give up on his homecoming. And I think this technological advancement, I think, is one element of a much bigger, temptation. Like, this is a utopia. And Odysseus has to choose between continuing on his journey and potentially not seeing his homecoming. But even if he does see his homecoming, he has no idea what it will be like back home.
Correct.
So you have a guaranteed utopia to stay in, or you have the risk of maybe never making it back home. And if you do make it back home, Penelope might be gone. She might have married someone else.
She might murder you at a banquet with her new lover, like Agamemnon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's jump to around 170. So this is Odysseus is in the palace, and he goes and he throws himself at the knees of the queen as he's supposed to. And this is a big kind of gasp moment in the palace, because right as he does this, Athena's lifting the mist. And so all of a sudden there's this man here who probably still looks like a god, at the knees of the queen.
He's probably appearing like a god too, especially if he's, just manifesting right there.
Correct. And so, we get this narrative where he talks about, Queen, Arete, etc. After many trials I've come to beg for mercy, your husband's yours, and all the feasters here. And so he gives this narrative, which is very much couched in, I am the stranger asking for the guest friendship, right? I'm throwing myself on the knees, which is exact saying this custom that we have of the knees, not only in guest friendship, but also just for mercy in general. We see this a lot in the Iliad of, someone who wants to be captured and not killed, throwing themselves at the knees of the man who's about to slaughter them. Most of the time, they get mercy. It occurs to me that, there was one that hugged Menelaus's knees, and Agamemnon killed him at Menelaus's knees and basically said, we don't have time, move on. And Achilles also killed men that were at his knees, right? Split their livers open, if I remember correctly. So this is just a general act we see of mercy, kind of coupled now with the theme of guest friendship. I personally, so last time I kind of asked you to be a guiding light to book 6. This next kind of little pericope, this little passage, I found so fascinating when I first read it. Because what happens? We've been talking about how amazing the queen is. We've been talking about how amazing the king is, right? We haven't really talked about that, but there's lots of narratives and little lines here of just like, whom we obey like a god, or our godlike king. I mean, it's not just Homer saying that. It's Nausicaa. It's the citizens saying that of their own king. He is high, right? He's the king of this utopian society. The response here is not what I expected. And Adam's our first time reader. He can't be here this week, but I'd be fascinated to see what he thought. Because what I expect is the queen would play an intercessor role, like we've talked about, and the king would give him this warm welcome, right? I mean, this is a high functioning, high cultured society. That's not what you get. You get silence. And not only silence, Odysseus just lets go of her knees. And he goes and sinks down in the ashes by the hearth. And everyone's just quiet. And what they're doing is they're waiting for, I mean, the queen says nothing. And I want to be careful about the read of that. But she says nothing. There's no, I mean, unless I'm misreading this or missing something, she says nothing. There's not even like she looks at the king, right? That earlier we talked about that a lot of time the feminine rhetoric is very subtle and indirect, right? And that there's this high capacity to communicate, a lot. And she does nothing, to my knowledge. And the kings are sitting there, and they've got a stranger in their home now wallowing over in the ashes. And it takes until the eldest lord in the home at the feast, he's the one that has to break in. And basically, how I read this was like, this is a what the hell are you doing moment. I mean, because this is not a, hey, can we do this? He says, this is no way, Alcinous. How indecent. Look, our guest is on the ground in the ashes by the fire. Come, raise him up. Seat the stranger now. Give him food and drink, etc. And by the way, then we mention, Zeus. And then he mentions guest friendship, explicitly, right? He's the champion here, the host, the guest. These rites are sacred. And basically, King Alcinous, he, or Alcinous, sorry, King Alcinous. I'd say there's like 19 ways I'm going to pronounce his name. He basically then just repeats verbatim part of the line that the eldest lord gave him. I mean, there's not even a whole lot of like waxing on here. And no, not to argue against myself. No, granted, once the guest friendship kicks in, I think it's probably one of the most beautiful guest friendships we see actually in the entire Odyssey. Because once it kicks in, I mean, not only do they not ask his name, which is custom, before they don't need to bathe him and clothe him, which there's kind of a joke coming up on that, but they feed him, but also they basically, it's like around 225 or so, the king's going to call an assembly, and they're already agreeing to take him home, and they don't even know where he lives. I mean, imagine that, right? We've all taken someone home, and like most of the time, what do? Before we give our act of charity, we say, wait, where do you live? Right? Do you live by me? Oh, okay, I'll take you home. Right? I live out in rural Oklahoma. Someone in Tulsa says, I'll take you home. That might be a while. And there's a certain part of this that there's a beautiful, once it kicks in, once the king kicks in, I think this is one of the best things of guest friendship we see in the entire text. But why? Why do we have this eldest lord has to stand up? What is the problem here?
Yeah, I think this is a very puzzling part of the narrative, and I think it's precisely so for all of the reasons that you've lined out. And I don't have a good answer for this other than, this might be an instance where they don't have strangers often, and the king, as the king, is trying to maybe gauge the room because he's interrupted a whole dinner party, right? Like there's got with him and they're having this party, and then this guy just kind of interrupts it. It could be the shock of Odysseus having simply appeared. Like, is this a god? Is this a test? Is this something? Like, just not knowing what to do. Or it could just be that uncertainty. Like, I can't extend hospitality here because if I do, and I don't have the backing of my citizens, then I can't do anything like that. But it is puzzling that the king here really hesitates. And he waits for not even the queen, but one of his lords to take the initiative and say that we need to offer this man this hospitality.
I think the best read of it that I can offer is one, what we've already talked about in Athena's commentary, that like this is a people that are actually very wary of strangers, right? There's a certain distrust here. We've used the word utopian. I think that because you couple their odd reaction with then a very strong guest friendship, it reminds me, right, of any time that we make a mistake. anytime that like something occurs and we should have done something but we didn't, but once it occurs to us that we're not doing what we're supposed to do, then all of a sudden we come back over the top and we're like, oh no, like what? No, okay, let me fix this, because now once it clicks, then I'm like, oh, okay, that's how I took it, was that no, these are good people, but like how often? I mean, Menelaus is having guys probably stop by Sparta all the time, right? Nestor is too. I mean, Nestor was feeding 4,500 people on the beach at a feast and welcoming people. As we've seen, you don't get a lot of people on your utopian island.
Yeah, there's a recency or a lack of recency, right? Like, when was the last time we had a guest? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? Like, who's supposed to speak? I don't know. Like, this ritual hasn't been done in however many years.
I realize this is a bit thick of an understanding of arete, of virtue, right? We don't really get this till Aristotle, but arete, the virtue, the excellence, is a habit. You have to have a habit of doing something. They have no habit of guest friendship. They might know about it as a concept, but they don't have a habit of this. And so that's what it strikes me as, and how I read it was simply like, this is something they know of. It's more theoretical than practical to them. And, thank God the eldest lord stands up and says, hey, everyone, guess what this is? Because he almost gives like a little reminder of like, hey, everyone remember guest friendship and like Zeus and like how it's supposed to work? And then the king's like, oh, yeah. But then I find it very heartfelt, right? I don't find it to be shallow.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, maybe there is, he says, so actually, and it's interesting how this Lord himself is introduced. At last the old revered Echeneus broke the spell, right? The old and revered, right? So he is one of the lords, but he's also mentioned as old. So maybe he's older than Alcinous, and maybe he's older than the king himself, that can break the silence and say, oh yeah, I remember the last guy we had 60 years ago, or however long it was.
Right. No, I like that.
Like, before we jump, I want to dwell on something that you mentioned as we kind of like overviewed this passage before, dwelling kind of on this hesitance here, which is down at 220, right? Like, when he offers this hospitality, there is no query of who are you? And I don't know how much you have touched on this, but it's kind of important that hospitality be offered to everyone. And it's fascinating because what this shows is a very strong sense of impartiality, right? That hospitality is for everyone. It doesn't matter if you are my arch enemy's grandson. I'm going to show you this hospitality, and only after I've cared for your basic human needs am I going to ask to hear your story and who you are and where you're going and how I can help you and these sorts of things. Well, I guess in this case, right, he's just offered, we'll take you home, of course, right? And like you said, he has no idea where that destination is. In the society of the Phaeacians, where they have self-piloting ships, maybe that's not such a generous offer as it might seem on the surface, but it is still a generous offer nonetheless, and a show of that hospitality.
No, I agree. I very much agree. So let's see here. So let's look at around 240 or so, because this goes into us discussing earlier about guest friendship, and one of the things about guest friendship is like, well, what if it's one of the gods, right? We have these myths of it's Zeus and Hermes that show up at the old couple's house that are poor and they give them everything. Like, there's these myths, and I found it interesting then that they basically talk about this, like, oh, well, what if he's a god? And the response is really interesting, right? But if this is 235 or so, but if he's one of the deathless powers out of the blue, the gods are working in strange new ways. Okay, so if you look at around 235 or so, as we kind of continue this theme of guest friendship, one of the things that we talk about is, like, the people who come to you, the strangers, might also be Zeus himself. They might be Hermes. We see this in the myths that we have. And so this kind of occurs to them. And I thought it was interesting that they say, but if he's one of the deathless powers out of the blue, the gods are working now in strange new ways. Because how are they habituated, the gods coming to them? Just openly. They just walk the streets of this utopia, right? It goes back to what you talked about and helped us navigate the genealogy here, that these people are descended from Poseidon. They're close to the gods. They have this high level of technology. They kind of have this utopian motif going on. And then you get again at 241 this statement that makes me a little nervous because of Troy, right? Will they disguise themselves? No, we're too close of kin for that. Close as the wild giants are, the Cyclops too, right? So they're talking about like, well, the gods will treat us a certain way because we're close to them, which again, no listener or reader of the Iliad, I think, puts a ton of stock into that. But I think you've done a good job of helping us to sketch out the mindset and the perceptions of the people on this island. And this is why, again, I think they're hesitant to welcome the stranger, right? They're not habituated to it. The gods don't come to us in disguise, they come to us in the open.
Yeah, and it is, yeah, and like you pointed out, right, when you're very insular, you're very isolated as a culture, there's no need to exercise that hospitality on a human level, and especially if guests are never gods, then there's no reason to ever treat a stranger like a god. And so you're right, there is maybe some sympathy that we can understand or read between the lines here that would allow us to be more charitable with the read on why is there some hesitation here, why does it get off, why does this guest friendship relationship get off on the wrong foot, even if, as it becomes apparent later, this is a tremendously hospitable civilization. So
Correct. So jumping ahead, Odysseus kind of responds to this. It's an interesting response. I think it shows his piety to a certain degree because he's compared to a god, and Odysseus pushes this back and says, "No, don't do that." Which is actually very similar, if you remember, to Menelaus. Telemachus will praise Menelaus's wealth. This must be like, he says something like, "This is what the Hall of Zeus must be like." Menelaus immediately pushes back on that. Probably because of piety, probably also because of what Zeus would do to you if you said, "Yes, I am like Zeus." Like, there's probably a love and fear thing going on here. And so Odysseus, he talks, if anyone's interested, at like 251 or so, he gives a wonderful little couple lines on like the belly and it being a shameless dog that I actually really enjoyed. I also thought it was funny after his talk that they all burst into applause. Like our stranger gives this like, which I didn't really find to be a highfalutin rhetorical paragraph. And it kind of struck me as odd. It's like, then they just like burst into applause about, this guest.
I feel like there has to be some kind of rhetorical twists or puns or things like that Odysseus is weaving into this that a translation doesn't afford. It is very unusual, at least in the English translation, why this would be the thing.
It's the same with his piety, so maybe because they're a culture close to the gods, and he demonstrates so much piety that they applaud. But you don't see a lot of applauding in the Odyssey, or really Homer in general. And so it just something that occurred to me or stuck out to me. Now let's look at the paragraph that I think is hilarious, right? And I think that in our Sunday Great Books, we taught, I think all of us found this hilarious, which is, so the party basically wraps up, and now the Queen Arete, is going to take Odysseus and basically show him to his quarters. And she's the first one that starts to question him, like, who are you, where are you from, etc. And then her last question, which I loved, was, who gave you the clothes that you're wearing now?
Oh yeah, it's so, and this is, I think, another good example of rhetoric, because what does she ask? She's like, "Oh, stranger, who are you? Where are you from? Like, we've promised you all of this hospitality. Now it's time. Like, now we've done the hospitality things. We've made you all the promises. We've given you a meal. We've given you a place to sleep. By the way, now that I fulfilled my part, where'd you get the clothes?" Because she recognizes the clothes, and she knows who went and did the laundry that day. So this is kind of Odysseus being caught, as you could imagine, caught in a very precarious situation because he dodged the bullet of making Nausicaa afraid of him and his, the sorry state he was in. Maybe she could have misread that situation. Now you're dealing with the mom. Wants to know, where have you been with my daughter? And so this is a very, it's a very hard situation for Odysseus. And it's interesting to me that he doesn't immediately answer her question. Instead, he spins her a yarn that lasts an entire couple of pages here. Before he kind of breaks the thing and said, "Oh yeah, and by the way, I met your daughter and she gave me the clothes."
Does this kind of strike me as the thing that I found really comical about this is that, she just kind of throws out this dagger, right? Who gave you the clothes that you're wearing now? And she's clever. Odysseus is clever. They all understand the implications of what was just asked. And what comes out of his mouth, in my opinion, is not a brilliant piece of rhetoric. It's what any adolescent does when they're like just they're just he just vomits out words. He's like, "Well, let me tell you, I started on an island, right?" Like he just I mean he's answering all of her questions, but
Do you have experiences of this with like
I might
any of your kids? It's just like who broke the thing? Well, it started when
right.
something happened 3 days ago.
Yeah. Back when I was born, it's like, no, no, speed up quicker than that. So, I mean, to read him, fairly, he is answering her other questions, but it's the last question that puts a lot of urgency and weight on this. And so it is really funny because it just kind of goes on and on. In the middle, I will just mention that I thought it was interesting that, he doesn't mention Ino, Athena, or the river god in this narrative of him coming that, which again, we're always going to be sensitive to when Odysseus is retelling a story. It's the same dynamic when we see in the Iliad, and we've seen it here too, where like the messenger comes, like Zeus tells the messenger, and the messenger tells Agamemnon. Like we're always watching for these cascading narratives or repeating narratives because something is added, something is left out, and so sometimes it matters a lot. Sometimes it's just a summary. But I did notice that it took three immortals to get the boy to shore, and none of them
Yeah.
are mentioned. And I,
None of them are, yeah, they don't feature prominently at all in his retelling.
but
And maybe that's an expedience thing, but it also could be, I mean, knowing, and this is another thing, politically on Odysseus's part, he knows that the Phaeacians are descended from Poseidon. Maybe he shouldn't mention the specific gods that he's, because what if one of them had told, yeah, Poseidon was doing this thing, and then this dumb goddess helped someone who tried to get back to shore when he wasn't supposed to. So, like, by conveniently avoiding all of those details, Odysseus doesn't give any indication that Poseidon's been the one that's been exiling him, because that's another layer to this political conversation Odysseus has to have, and the care with which he has to conduct himself here. He has to be very careful with his identity. He gives no identifying information here. He doesn't say he's from Ithaca. He doesn't give them his name. He doesn't give them any identifying information about anything that happened at Troy. But almost anywhere else, you would want to say, I went and fought at Troy, and like I was this great warrior, and like, yeah, like that would,
we should keep in mind he's famous.
yeah,
Like everyone knows who he is.
and everyone would play on this fame, and anyone who wanted to host Odysseus, or wanted to host, like anyone he could potentially have to host him, he could just say, I'm Odysseus, the one who fought at Troy and sacked and razed it down, right? Like I was the one who made the Greeks win the war. And anybody would want to host him, except for potentially the Phaeacians, who Odysseus knows doesn't like him right now. So he's being very careful with his identity throughout this entire response. He talks about what happened to him. And I think, there's some of this that you jump on here. Odysseus is probably filling a lot of gap. Like he's like just trying to fill up space so that he can think of how he wants to respond here. Because he's put like this question on the spot, and so he has to like give himself some time to figure out how to broach the touchy subject of how he came to wear these clothes that he's wearing.
I
But
agree.
then what is he? Yeah, so he does eventually touch onto it, right? He says, I looked up, and there were your daughter's maids at play on the beach, and she moved among them like a deathless goddess. So again, back to the flattery, back to the everything. I begged her for help, and this is something interesting too. Odysseus kind of shields Nausicaa a little bit in this response. He says that her sense of tact did not desert her. One so young, not in a random meeting, time and again the youngsters prove so flighty. So what is he doing here? He's saying what she wants to hear without explicitly saying it. No, we didn't sleep together. What he says is, she did not ever lose her sense of tact. She behaved as you'd never hope to find in one so young, in some random meeting. For time and again, the youngsters prove so flighty, right? Like, she's not she gave me food aplenty and shining wine and all of this. She gave me the clothing. That's my whole story. So he really tries to put this in such a way that he's like, your daughter is exceptionally well behaved, and that's what I have to say about this. Like
But
he's
what do you mean? Can I push into this a bit?
Mhm.
But wouldn't you expect him there to be this a little bit more explicit? So this is the Odysseus that, we're trying to figure out earlier why he wouldn't let the handmaids bathe him. And a lot of that narrative, from book six went into things like, well, maybe he's tempted by her and he's trying to put some distance. That's one thought. Another thought is that, Nausicaa doesn't actually have the capacity or the authority to bathe him. A third thought, which, not that one precludes the other, but then, the third thought is like, well, what if he says yes and these women are all bathing him and he's a stranger and an authority figure does show up, or the men from town show up, right? So with all of that, like, clarification and details and the subtleties and sensitivities that he shows there, does he not just railroad this? He says, oh, she's tactful, XYZ, she's not flighty. And he says, she gave me food aplenty, shining wine, a bath in the river too, and gave me all this clothing.
And that doesn't seem very not incriminating.
No, that's not incriminating at all. Like, shouldn't you say, like, I bathed myself? Like, why would he go through all of the gymnastics to deny in book six that they should bathe him? And talk about being embarrassed, which I don't think anyone believed, and step aside from this normative custom. And then here, I mean, if you didn't know what happened in book six and you just heard, she gave me food aplenty, shining wine, a bath in the river too, what are you going to think?
I mean, I think, and I don't know, like, this is a good question because you're right. I mean, I think Odysseus could very easily have given the same line about, oh, well, she offered to bathe me, but I was embarrassed. And again, they would know he's cultured enough that that wouldn't be the case. So they'd be able to read the lines between there, just like Nausicaa was. And so I think you're right. I think there is some elements of Odysseus's rhetoric or ordinary rhetorical skill that seems to fail him here. And yeah, I don't know that there's an easy response to that. Like, why doesn't he just kind of come out and say it? Or why, if he's so desperately trying to avoid suspicion, why doesn't he, explain things in as much detail as he can? I don't know. Maybe part of it is he's concerned that, like, if he goes into so much detail, they're going to think that he's just making things up. And maybe that's why he spends so much more detail on, like, his woes, right? And everything that's, I've had a long day. And then he gives them the short answer, which is that, she's fine. She gave me this hospitality and we parted ways.
Well, let's look at this again because you mentioned that, he's basically somewhat running interference. And then he does this pretty explicitly, right? So if you push on in the narrative, the king says, oh yeah, she has good sense, but she did miss the mark, right? She didn't escort you to our house with all her maids. Like, why would she find you out in the woods, help you with the hospitality, and then leave you to come in here by yourself? Which is a fair question. And
and underneath that, right, is, the king kind of trying to call Odysseus a little bit on it because he's like, oh, well, if you weren't doing something risque out in the woods, why wouldn't you come into town together, kind of thing. So I think this is the king testing Odysseus now, like measuring, like probing a little bit into his story.
I think here then, so I like that. So let's take that, let's read this as like this is the king with his rhetoric and he's testing. Because then the epithet we get here, right, the adjective is diplomatic, Odysseus answered. But is this really like a great thing of rhetoric? Like, does he really kind of like, untie this knot? It doesn't seem like he does. It seems like he just straight up lies, right? Don't find fault with your flawless daughter, not for my sake. She urged me herself to follow with her maids. I chose not to, fearing embarrassment, in fact. What if you took offense, seeing us both together? Suspicious we are, we men who walk the earth. So, in one hand, this is just a lie, right? He just straight up lies. And in second, because he gives a rationale to the lie, I think he is trying to answer the king as to why this would not have been a good idea to begin with. Even though he puts the blame on himself, I think he's trying to explain to the king rhetorically, like, this would not have been great for us to do this.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there is, and to be entirely honest, I think there is such a cultural gap here. Especially when we're talking about this very densely woven rhetoric. I have a sense that likely in kind of this original language and it's an original cultural context, that these particular exchanges would have a lot more punch than they do in their kind of translation. So I think we have to probably like give some possibility that there's something or some serious elements of this that are lost in translation. Because you're right, kind of kind of wishy-washy, lackluster in our estimation response. But I think too, like so for example, don't find fault with a flawless daughter now. I wonder what that word flawless means. I wonder if it's a pun or maybe related to a word that could be used to imply chastity or virginity, right? Because that was
Right.
how Nausicaa was being described in the Odyssey earlier. So yeah, don't find fault with a flawless daughter. Then you, like you said, he does make up this lie, which is that she urged me to follow herself, and I chose not to, feeling embarrassment. So there's that embarrassment line again, which again, I think it probably is it's not a red flag to Alcinous, but it's a key, or it's like a clue that I'm not being honest here, right? Like I didn't actually feel embarrassed. That wasn't the motivation for not doing this. So I think he says that knowing that the king's going to be able to clue in and realize that his intentions are like, he knows how precarious this political situation is. Because then he follows up, what if you took offense seeing us both together? And then he goes in and he kind of like, this is something we saw with Nausicaa, right? Where he basically speaks exactly to her fear, without explicitly saying it. He says, you are like Artemis, right? Like, and by saying that, he's implying, I have no intentions whatsoever of approaching you in this way. Because the last guy who did this got ripped to pieces by his own dogs. So I'm not going to do that because I think you're Artemis. And then he kind of like comes back later and says, oh, by the way, I know that you're mortal and I know what the situation is. So what he says here to the king, I know you don't trust me, like, and so I give you that, like, we are suspicious, and so this is why I chose not to do this. I think he's also speaking in a generality that would speak to the culture as a whole, that he didn't want to give offense not only to the king, but to everyone else, because he also knows that the king is in a hard position with respect to his daughter's marriage. And remember, he was what Nausicaa was warning Odysseus about was, if we just walked into town together, there'd be an uproar, and there might be, who knows, a riot in this utopia because everyone wants to marry the king's daughter, and she's going to go off and marry a foreigner. And so maybe he's like hinting at here, I did you a favor by not doing this because we're suspicious, we men who roam the earth, we strangers, and if there was a stranger who came into town with Nausicaa, everyone would assume the worst about you because they would have assumed that maybe you had been arranging a secret marriage and your daughter was going down to fetch me or whatever. You know, like there's a lot of, and maybe that's part of what he's getting at.
One of the interesting things about your insight into Nausicaa, and if they're seen together, does this cause unrest, things of that nature, does that not make her an analog to Helen? Because if you remember the myth of Helen, we've talked about it on the podcast before, is that, she's the daughter of Zeus, and she was so beautiful that, her earthly father, her mother's husband, doesn't know what to do with her, so he has all these suitors. And so it's causing unrest in ancient Greece, and he has to come up with this promise that whoever takes her won't fight against the other one, and they'll all fight against the one who does take her. Hence, running off with a foreign element, right, causes Paris, causes the Trojan War. Is there not like a microcosm here that Nausicaa is this beautiful woman? She's not marrying anyone on the island, on this insular little community. Here comes Odysseus, an alien element. Like, is he not a threat then to the utopia? Is there not a play back and forth between Nausicaa and Helen?
No, I think that's, yeah. And I mean, I think that's exactly it. And I think there's an element too of like an echo, I guess you could say, of Penelope in this. Because what's going on back in Ithaca? Well, Penelope is, she has all of these suitors and they're all vying for her affection and she's spurning all of them. And, her father Laertes is going to have to, at some point, if they know, like if they learn that Odysseus is dead, he's going to have to figure out which one of these guys is going to marry her. But it's probably not going to be an easy resolution either. So I think there's echoes of both Helen and Penelope kind of in this situation. And yeah, I think Odysseus, in his diplomatic fashion, is telling Alcinous, like, you didn't really want me to come into town with her, did you? Right? Like, this would have been bad for you just as much as it would have been bad for me. So this is why we didn't do this. So yeah, and I think there's a reassurance there because obviously, and there are some difficulties with this passage. Like, did Odysseus really answer the question? Did he really reassure them in the way that completely satisfied or assuaged all their fears? Maybe not, but it satisfies Alcinous because he says, "Oh no, my friend, I'm hardly a man for reckless idle anger. Balance is best in all things." So he comes back with this measured response saying like, "I'm not angry with you. I can see the reasonableness of your actions here." But then he says, "Father Zeus, Athena, and Lord Apollo," like he's swearing by the gods, "we think as one, you could wed my daughter and be my son-in-law and stay right here with us." And so that's, he won over dad, which good for, good for him, right? Like he went from, did you, like this kind of accusation of, hey, what were you doing when you were alone with my daughter, to, well, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and let you be my son-in-law, right? Like, which is kind of interesting. Like you said, there was a similar arc with Nausicaa, right, where she went from maybe being afraid of Odysseus as a potential predator to being, I kind of want to marry you, and I'm gonna give you this subtle hint that I would be interested in receiving your marriage proposal. And so now this is kind of the same thing that happened with the king, right?
Yeah, and what concerns me here, and what we mentioned back on book 6, is that now the temptation of Nausicaa of Nausicaa, I'll get it. I've only said it 1,000 times already. Nausicaa, the temptation becomes explicit. So here it is, right? Because we had, like, as you were very good at pointing out, of like, look, are we paying attention to these sensities and these subtleties and things like this?
And now it's not subtle.
And now it's not subtle. It's just like, hey, by the way, do you want to marry my daughter and remain here in this utopia? And yeah, and I think maybe to clarify something I said earlier, because I want to make sure, because the Odyssey has an interesting chronology. I should say at this point we are not sure, or we don't know what Odysseus actually knows. We're not entirely sure whether he knows the Agamemnon narrative. We're not entirely sure if he knows what's going on in Ithaca, because we've joined him like 9 years deep on Calypso's island. He's come here. We have a gap in our narrative. So I should make that a little bit more clear. We're not quite sure what he knows. We assume, I think the general assumption would be that he doesn't know, right? I think that's a fair assumption right now, because how would he? And
right. Well, so yeah, we as readers, like, so right now we're at book 7, right? And there's like 24 books in this whole thing. So we as the readers have not been exposed to anything that give us any indication that Odysseus knows more than he does. But it has been 18 years, right, since he's been back home from Ithaca, and it's been 8 years since he's been done with Troy, and kind of he began his homecoming journey. But he also spent 8 years with Calypso, who is a goddess, and Hermes was there. And so there are other things later that will show us how much Odysseus actually really does know. But as for this point in the narrative, we don't know how much Odysseus knows or doesn't know about what's going on in Ithaca, what's happened with Agamemnon, or anything else. But so, yeah, there's either Odysseus does know, in which case he knows how bad it is back home, and this is a utopia where there's no problems. Or he doesn't know, and he's betting on an uncertainty, right? Like, I could go all the way home and it could not be how I found it or how I left it, and it could be this terrible place where I'm going to get murdered by my own wife, or because I think even without the Agamemnon thread, like even without the explicit Agamemnon narrative, think about it. If you've been away from home for 18 years on a war campaign, I think that's just a natural anxiety one would have. my home going to actually be home? Or is it going to have changed so dramatically that I don't even want to be there anymore? Um,
Correct. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that at least my take here would be that this represents a much more dangerous temptation than Calypso.
no,
Once you understand why he said no, because I think at first, if you were just on its face said, okay, well, what's the greater temptation? Yeah, you get to marry the young princess that's like Artemis and live in the utopia, but you're still going to age and die. So if you have like a hedonistic, pleasure-based mentality, that doesn't seem like the greatest temptation. The temptation is to stay immortal in Calypso's basically pleasure cave and have whatever you want, including her. That, however, once you understand why he says no, or at least why we think he says no, is that he understands. Sure, you could say because he wants to go home, he wants to see Calypso, or excuse not Calypso, he wants to see Penelope. That's that's true. That's a very strong read of his own, Arete, his excellence. I think a lot of it is what Homer, at least Homer the teacher, is showing us is that I think Odysseus understands that immortality is actually a trap, that it's actually a hellhole because of the other myths that are mentioned there. The male gods hate you; they might give it to you, but there's actually a curse baked into it. Like it's
or like
unnatural
it's
for man.
never what it's never what it actually seems, right? Like there's
Correct.
always a string attached to the kindness or the temptation or the blessing
Hmm.
of immortality. It's not actually a blessing for mortals because it always carries a hefty price or some kind of string attached that is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, you could be immortal, but then be chained to a rock and have an eagle eat your liver out every day, right? I mean, immortality doesn't actually equal, that this thing is going to be great. So once you understand that, I think then the Nausicaa temptation becomes a lot more dangerous for Odysseus because it's a natural temptation. And then you stack on that she is like a young Penelope. She's beautiful, clever, she is politically savvy. I think this is a big temptation. And I think it's a temptation too because, but as a first time reader, you might read this and say, well, he seems to shrug this off pretty well, right? Because the king says, listen, you could marry my daughter, X, Y, and Z, but by the way, tomorrow we'll talk about taking you home. We could do that pretty easily too. Odysseus is interesting here. Odysseus basically just responds on 380 saying, may the king fulfill his promises one and all, then his fame would ring through the fertile earth and never die, and I should reach my native land at last. So he tells the king, right? He implies like, no, I want to be taken home. But it's very interesting that he's actually silent on the offer of Nausicaa. He actually doesn't respond to it directly.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe part of what Homer's indicating, and I think about Homer too, right? Homer's a poet, right? He's performing for an audience. He has to draw on some kind of dramatic tension for his audience. And this is one of those places where he's drawing out this drama of Odysseus doesn't actually say no. And they're going to have a conversation tomorrow about sending him home. He could sleep on this decision, right? And come to a different conclusion now. And so I think, yeah, I think this should give us a little bit of a pause, like, oh, is he actually going to make it back home? Another interesting note is that, so a brief note on the chronology of the Odyssey as a whole, is that these so very quickly we're going to see a shift where we spend a lot of time on Odysseus's retelling of his journeys. And so chronologically, we're going to hear about a lot of different things that are more or less popular. Some people know these stories. Some people remember them from reading the Odyssey in high school. I remember them from like his story with the Cyclops and things, just my reading of it on a basic fiction level. But in terms of the temptation, this is the last chronological place that Odysseus is tempted to stay somewhere other than home. And so in that respect, I think we can, if we follow that into this next section where Odysseus will begin to start talking about his journeys in more depth, we can maybe find in his earlier journeys lesser temptations, but then culminating in these greater two temptations, which are namely the temptation to immortality on Calypso's island, followed by perfect mortal happiness on the Phaeacian island. And I think read that way, this is Odysseus's final and ultimate test. Will he make it back? Will he stay in this utopia, or will he continue on his journey? Or will he be dissuaded, and will he decide it's not worth going back? So
That is good. That is good. We will have to continue to track our hero and see what he does with his temptations.
or what he's done in the past with his temptations, right? And then
Correct.
what is his ultimate decision with regard to staying with Nausicaa and on this utopian island with all of these incredible machines or not?
No, I agree. I think there's particularly because one of the things we mentioned on the podcast when we talked about the Calypso and the denial of immortality, how Odysseus has the capacity to actually make that decision and why he really knows that immortality is a trap. I think when he retells his story, we'll see that there are narratives that have actually prepared him for that. And there's a lot of things that come to mind there about that prepared him. It's going to be interesting to read through it now, also thinking about Nausicaa in mind and whether or not something is also preparing him for that temptation as well. All right. Well, very good, Mr. Eli Stone. We greatly appreciate you coming on Ascend, the Great Books podcast. Really appreciate you helping us with Book 6 and Book 7. Really appreciated your insights. Everyone, you can go to thegreatbookspodcast.com, and if you appreciated our comments tonight, you can find our question and answer guide on the Odyssey, and we will see you next week for Book 8. Thank you, everyone.